Okay, so here's a lecture on human body systems. Due to the length of this chapter, I'm going to go ahead and divide up the chapter into two lectures. All right, so the first one is going to cover all the way to the immune system, right? So I'm going to go ahead and go over homeostasis, the digestive system, nutrition, digestive problems, respiratory system, circulatory system, cardiovascular system, blood, and immune system. Okay, so up to here. And then the other lecture is going to cover the rest. All right, so starting off with just kind of defining, if you will, what anatomy is. Anatomy is essentially the parts, right, of the organism. And then physiology describes how the parts work, and specifically how the parts work together in order to achieve some sort of goal. Okay, like for example, the pancreas, right? Well, the parts of the pancreas are the cells and the types of tissue that make up the pancreas. Like for example, the beta cells and the alpha cells of the pancreas. All right, so the parts. Now, what they do, right? Alpha cells creating glucagon, which is a hormone, and then beta cells creating insulin, right? So that is the physiology of the pancreas. But then overall, those hormones play a larger role within the organism. All right, so those are going to be increasing blood glucose in the case of glucagon, and that is done through several intricate mechanisms, like, for example, gluconeogenesis. Okay, so that increases blood glucose in the blood. And then insulin actually lowers blood glucose in the blood. How does it do it? Well, by complex mechanisms of opening receptors called GLUT receptors, which are glucose receptors. Okay, insulin opens them up, and then glucose manages to go from the blood into the cells so they can be processed to make ATP. Okay, so before beginning with the body systems, let me go over the tissues that our bodies are organized into. Keep in mind, we're made of cells. Okay, we have diploid eukaryotic cells. Okay, cells aggregated together form tissues. We have four major types of tissues in our bodies. All right, so what are tissues? Well, tissues again are aggregations. They're collections of cells, specific types of cells that are going to go ahead and carry on with some sort of goal, if you will, right? So, and tissues become part of organs, if you recall. Okay, so starting off with connective tissue, which essentially consists of cells scattered throughout an extracellular matrix, like for example, bone, right? Bone is made up of this chemical called hydroxyapatite, which contains calcium and it contains phosphate. Okay, so again, bone is a type of connective tissue. Blood is made up of red blood cells and white blood cells. Cartilage is essentially a type of solid material that can either work together with bone or become bone itself. If cartilage is calcified, it'll become bone, and this happens in the production of bone. Okay, so but cartilage, nevertheless, is going to be made up mostly of collagen fibrous tissue, right? Which is very, very strong. And then sometimes, again, it works together with bone in order to create these protective structures, like the ribs, for example, right? Most of the ribs are made up of bones, but they actually connect to the sternum, which is this bone right here, right? They connect to the sternum using pieces of cartilage, essentially. Now that I'm mentioning collagen, bone is also enmeshed in a network of collagen. Okay, and bone slash collagen combination makes bone essentially stronger, or our skeletal system stronger. Okay, so now adipose tissue is fatty tissue. Okay, so the way in which we store fat is in these cells called adipocytes. All right, so using those cells, we're able to store fat for later use. Epithelial tissues or coverings, if you will. So our entire skin is an epithelial tissue, but also the lining of our oral cavity, so the mouth, is also made up of epithelial tissue. The digestive tract is also made up of epithelial tissue. So essentially, if it's exposed to the environment in some way, then it's probably going to be made up of epithelial tissue. And there's many subtypes, which I'm not going to go over. Now, nervous tissue is another type of tissue which makes up the brain and the spinal cord and the nerves. We also have muscular tissue, 3 types. We have smooth muscle, mostly found in blood vessels and digestive tract, and also part of the reproductive system. Cardiac muscle, rather, right? Cardiac muscle is essentially found in the heart, and then skeletal muscle makes up all of the muscles that you think of moving, right? So every muscle that is attached to your bones, right? Those are skeletal muscles. Now, again, those tissues make up organs, and then together organs make up organ systems. And these organ systems have many different functions, right? All of which have to be maintained within a certain parameter, if you will, in terms of physiological function, right? So that maintenance within parameters is called homeostasis, okay? So now each organ is going to have its own type of homeostasis, but essentially homeostasis is maintaining a nice balance, right, of in terms of physiological function of the organs. All right, so now sometimes some organs are thrown off balance, right? Their homeostatic levels either can go up or can go down, or we can kick those homeostatic levels off track, if you will, right? So diabetes is essentially one type of a homeostatic imbalance, right? If it happens to where the person cannot produce enough insulin, right, then again we're dealing with either type 1 diabetes, or if the cells of the person cannot respond normally to insulin, then we're dealing with type 2 diabetes. Okay, so now the integumentary system is basically the skin, hair, and nails. Okay, what I'm showing here is a cross-section of the skin. Right, so notice how it has actually 3 main layers. One is the epidermis, which is this top layer. 2 is the dermis, which is the middle layer, and then the hypodermis, which is not shown here, but it's beneath the dermis. Okay, it includes adipose tissue, blood, and blood vessels there, and nerves for that matter. Okay, so notice how hair follicles are embedded within the dermis, and then the hair strand itself grows from the follicle and protrudes out, right through the epidermis. All right, so the epidermis is made up of 20 to 30 layers of epithelial tissue, which is meant to provide protection. Notice also how we have tiny little muscles embedded within the dermis, and these are in charge of controlling these hair follicles. Okay, so you also have sweat pores, which connect to sweat glands, right? These sweat glands are responsible for releasing water, right, onto the skin And this water has a combination of enzymes, sodium chloride, and other chemicals, which are meant to kill off bacteria on the skin, most bacteria on the skin. But also the water is meant to cool down the skin. Oil glands are also present in the dermis. What oil glands are going to do, right? They're going to go and release small amounts of oil onto the skin so that we can be provided with some sort of protection and also to reduce water loss. All right, so now in terms of homeostasis, okay, we have two types of mechanisms that can control homeostasis. We have negative feedback, and then we have positive feedback mechanisms. So let's go over negative feedback here real quick. In order to maintain homeostasis, right, keep in mind that since we're constantly being exposed to the environment, several different mechanisms, physiological mechanisms in the body can be thrown off balance. For example, temperature, right? If you go outside right now, right, it's going to be really hot, right? Especially in the afternoon hours. It's going to be really hot. So your body temperature is going to go ahead and start raising, right? So it's going to start rising. Now, at a certain point, as soon as your body temperature goes up above 99, right, your body's going to start acting, because otherwise, if your body temperature goes up way too much, then you can start losing proteins, right? You can start denaturing proteins, which is not necessarily good for the physiology, for the functioning of those proteins, right? So what is the body going to do? Well, using the hypothalamus in the brain, the hypothalamus is going to go and detect the temperature change. It's going to determine that your body temperature is actually going up, right? And then as a consequence, it's going to go ahead and send signals to the body to start sweating, right? So the outcome is going to be that the sweat glands are going to start producing a lot of sweat, so that your skin can become moist. And as a consequence, your skin can be cooled down, right? So in that manner, you can go ahead and lose heat. Now, if you go outside in the winter, then it's going to be cold, right? What's going to happen as a consequence is that your hypothalamus is going to go ahead and detect that it's cold outside, right? And if you're not wearing enough protection against the cold, if you're not wearing a jacket, right, or a thick enough jacket, then you're going to start shivering. Okay, so these shivers are essentially muscle contractions, involuntary muscle contractions, which are meant to increase your body temperature there. All right. So now the digestive system is also known as the alimentary canal. Okay, so what it's going to do is it's going to go ahead and process food, absorb nutrients, so that our cells can attain the nutrients necessary for them to produce ATP, for them to produce energy. Okay, so starting at the mouth, right? The mouth is also known as the oral cavity. Keep in mind, this is the site of ingestion, right? So you're taking food through your mouth, you masticate it, you chew it, right? Break it down into smaller pieces, and then after which time we swallow that food. So using the pharynx and some muscles that we have in this region here, including the tongue muscles, we're able to swallow the food that we have just masticated. All right, so after swallowing, then the food is going to go ahead and follow the esophageal route. It's going to go ahead and make it to the stomach, right, through the esophagus, so that the stomach can continue with mechanical and also chemical digestion. All right, so using powerful digestive enzymes and acids, right, this food is going to be further broken down into the nutrients that are necessary for us to sustain life, right? So now the movement of food from the pharynx all the way down to the stomach, that's called peristalsis. And that continues to the small intestine and also throughout the large intestine. And peristalsis is simply smooth muscle contraction that pushes food down the digestive tract. Now, once food is pushed over to the small intestine, right? Here's the stomach here. Once the stomach is done processing the food, it goes in and pushes it over to the duodenum, which is the beginning of the small intestine, right? And then from the duodenum, it makes it into the jejunum, which is most of the small intestine. And then at the end, it reaches the ileum, which is the last part of the small intestine that connects over to the colon right here. The colon is the large intestine. What does the small intestine do? Well, it goes ahead and extracts all of the nutrients that are found in the food that you ate. Okay. Now from there, the large intestine, starting with the ascending colon here, the transverse colon, descending colon, and then rectum, goes ahead and processes whatever was not absorbed. Okay, if it was not absorbed, then it's waste and it becomes feces. Okay, so that's what the large intestine does. By using bacteria, right? That bacteria go ahead and process the waste, turning it into feces. All right, so later, once that feces goes ahead and makes it to the rectum, then it's going to go ahead and stimulate the anus, the anal sphincters essentially, to stimulate them so that we can expel that feces. All right, so we have accessory organs of digestion as well, like for example, the liver and the pancreas and the gallbladder. So what the liver is going to do in terms of digestion, okay, so the liver has many functions, some of which are digestive. What it's going to do is it's going to produce this chemical called bile. Okay, so the liver is made up of hepatocytes. Okay, it's divided up into three different lobes, right? You're looking at two lobes here, the other one is in the back. These lobes are made up of specific cells called hepatocytes. One of the functions of hepatocytes is to produce bile. Okay, so what bile is going to do is it's going to go ahead and be stored in the gallbladder. The gallbladder is located inferior to the liver, almost hidden within the liver tissue, but underneath, right? It's not embedded, it's under the liver. So the gallbladder stores bile, and then using these bile ducts, right, it goes ahead and releases that bile over to the duodenum of the small intestine through small openings, right, that connect the gallbladder to the duodenum. So once that bile is released into the duodenum, then bile goes ahead and interacts with fats that we have ingested. Okay, so and what bile is going to do is it's going to go ahead and emulsify those fats. Okay, it's going to go ahead and bring those fats together to make it easier for the small intestine to absorb lipids from the fats that we have ingested. All right, so that's what the liver and the gallbladder do. Okay, so the pancreas is another accessory organ of digestion. The pancreas has two main functions. One is endocrine, the other one is digestive. Okay, so in terms of digestion, what the pancreas is going to do is it's going to go ahead and produce this chemical called bicarbonate, right? Bicarbonate is produced in some of the cells of the pancreas. It's released into the duodenum as well to be able to counteract the effects of acid that might have percolated over to the small intestine from the stomach. Okay, we don't want acid in the small intestine. That's why we release bicarbonate into the small intestine, or one of the reasons why, so that we can go ahead and neutralize any acid that might have made it from the stomach to the small intestine. All right, so again, food processing occurs in 4 stages that have already been mentioned. First is eating it, ingesting it. Second is digestion, mechanical and chemical. Third is absorption, and then fourth is elimination. Okay, so so digestion, there's 2 types of digestion, right? We have mechanical and we have chemical. So mechanical digestion goes ahead and churns essentially the food so that we can break it down into smaller pieces. The mouth does that, and also the stomach also does that. Chemical digestion happens through the use of enzymes and acids within and digestive juices within the stomach, so that we can begin the breakdown, right? The chemical breakdown, molecular breakdown of food into actual nutrients that we can absorb using our small intestine. All right, so next is going to be the absorption, right, which is using the small intestine, okay, these microvilli of the small intestine, to be able to absorb those nutrients that were broken down by the stomach. And then anything that wasn't used is eliminated using the large intestine. All right, so by now you should know that food provides the fuel. That's why we need to consume food. And our fuel is going to be in the form of ATP. Okay, so our cells also need their share of essential nutrients, right? So in order to gain optimal essential nutrients, it's recommended that we mostly consume vegetables. Okay, so next from there is grains and protein, and then fruits, right? We also need a little bit of dairy as well, so that we can get more minerals like calcium, for example. But notice how vegetables make up most of the idealized diet, and that is because the ideal normal diet and the primitive diet of the human being has always been plant-based. Okay, if you analyze what our ancestors used to eat, right, 50,000, 100,000 years ago, you would find that they had a mostly plant-based diet. All right, they used to hunt, evidently, right? But hunting was kind of limited, because hunting takes a lot of energy, right? And for the most part, it could not be done by one person, right? It needed to be done in groups, in teams. So therefore, that took time. Okay, so if a tribe or a community, right, 50,000 years ago, was to consume some food, right, and some meat rather, right, they would have to again form these little groups that would go out to the wild to hunt, and again they would come back a few days later with with the meat that they actually caught, right, captured in the wild, and they would have their feasts and whatnot, right, every week or so. So again, most of the ideal diet of the human being should be composed of plant-based diets. Grains are plants, fruits are plants, vegetables are plants, protein and dairy. Dairy is mostly animal, evidently, but then protein is mostly found in animal meat, but you can also get protein from vegetables. Okay, so just consuming a plant-based diet, 100% plant-based diet, you wouldn't suffer from that, because plants contain all of the amino acids that we need. Some common ailments of the digestive system include acid reflux, gallstones, constipation, appendicitis, cholera, IBD, or inflammatory bowel disease, and ulcers. Real quick, acid reflux is basically the stomach returning acid, making too much acid and returning it back into the esophagus. Gallstones or obstructions within the bile ducts of the gallbladder. Constipation essentially means that we're not releasing enough water into the small intestine, right, via the feces. Therefore, feces become hardened, and it's really hard to push them down through peristalsis. Appendicitis is an inflammation of the appendix. Cholera is a large intestine disease caused by infection, rather, caused by the cholera bacterium. Inflammatory bowel disease is basically autoimmune, right? Can be autoimmune, but certain chemicals, certain substances that we ingest can cause our bowels to become inflamed, right? Which can cause problems, evidently. And then ulcers are lesions within the small intestine or large intestine, or even the stomach as well. Some larger health problems dealing with digestive system are obesity, diabetes, malnutrition, anorexia, bulimia, right? So those are extreme problems of digestive system. Okay, so now into the respiratory system. All right, so the respiratory system allows us to breathe. Okay, it allows us to inhale air using our lungs and then exhale excess air. Okay, so why do we inhale? Well, because we need oxygen, right? Now, the oxygen that's found in air is actually combined with other gases. Most of the gas that we inhale is nitrogen, okay? But if we don't have the adaptation to extract nitrogen from the air, we only have the adaptation to extract oxygen. Oxygen is about 20% concentrated in air, with higher altitudes having less oxygen, okay? So our alveolar adaptations inside of the lungs allow us to extract oxygen, okay? So starting off with the nasal cavity, right? The nasal cavity is the uppermost respiratory structure that we have. Going down into the pharynx, larynx, and then into the trachea. The trachea is covered by this flap of tissue called the epiglottis. The trachea is mostly made up of cartilage, and it goes ahead and bifurcates. It branches out into the two lungs. Once the trachea makes it into the lungs, it's not called trachea anymore, it's called bronchi. All right, so we have one bronchus, another bronchus here. Those bronchi expand, they branch out into thousands, right, of smaller little structures called alveoli, even millions of these, right, alveoli. Alveoli are air sacs, right? So those are these structures that allow us to exchange CO2 for oxygen. CO2 is a waste product of our metabolism. It's a waste product of the Krebs cycle. And then oxygen is the gas that we need, right, to extract from the air so that our cells can carry on with cell respiration, which is the making of ATP. All right, so some problems that can affect the circulatory system are emphysema, for example, which is basically a breakdown of the alveoli, right? So by introducing these chemicals that are not supposed to be in the alveoli, and these chemicals coming from cigarettes, right? Those can actually damage the alveoli, right? So damaging the alveoli makes them unavailable for respiration. So therefore, people with emphysema have trouble breathing, right? Because they start to lose their air sacs. Bronchitis is also another common problem dealing with the viral infections mostly. Bronchitis is an inflammation of the bronchi, of these tubes, right, of the airways, if you will. We also have upper respiratory infections that can be caused by either viruses or bacteria, right? And those affect mostly the nasal cavity. There's also asthma, right, which is inflammation of the airways. And now that I'm here, and dealing with the current situation, right, with COVID-19. Right, COVID-19 is a disorder, a disease caused by the SARS-2 virus, essentially. Okay, so the current virus that's out causing this pandemic is called SARS-CoV-2. Okay, so it's two because it's the second time this happens. Okay, it's the a strain of the virus that we have never seen before. But regardless, we had already seen a SARS-1 virus back in the early 2000s. Okay, so that pandemic was known as the SARS pandemic. Again, it happened in the early 2000s, and then it happened again, and it was denominated the MERS pandemic, and then here it is again. Okay, but MERS was a different virus. Okay, the one that we have nowadays is called SARS-CoV-2, and I'm showing this because SARS-CoV-2 infects the cells of the alveoli. Okay, so these cells are called, there's two types, there's alveolar type 1 and alveolar type 2. SARS-CoV-2 infects alveolar type 2 cells. Okay, so in a person who is immunocompromised, then the virus is going to go ahead and destroy these cells. Destroying these cells destroys the air sacs. Okay, so that's why people with COVID-19 have trouble breathing, is because, again, that virus managed to destroy these air sacs. Alrighty, so SARS-CoV-2 is very deadly, right? But nevertheless, most people contain the immunity, right? They contain the antibodies against the virus. That's why, you know, only a very small subset of the population that's actually infected actually die from this virus. Most of the people that get infected with it survive because we have the immunity against the virus. Okay, so now into the circulatory system. So as you know, right, the circulatory system is made up of the heart, blood vessels. Okay, blood vessels, there's two types. We have arteries and we have veins. All right, so what arteries are going to do is they're going to go ahead and carry blood away from the heart, and this blood is oxygenated blood that came from the lungs, essentially. Right? Veins are going to go ahead and return deoxygenated blood back to the heart so that the heart can go ahead and route it over to the lungs to be oxygenated. Okay, so now the connection between the two is called capillaries, and these capillaries occur in muscles and also in organs, right? And capillaries allow for the exchange of deoxygenated blood with oxygenated blood, essentially. So the flow of blood is going to take place from the arteries into the veins through capillary beds. So we have two types of circulation, right? Blood circulation. We have the pulmonary circuit, which is going to go ahead and shunt blood over to the lungs, right? Using obviously the right part of the heart. So blood is going to be shunted over to the lungs so that the lungs can go ahead and oxygenate that blood. And then it's going to go ahead and return back into the left side of the heart. And then the left ventricle is going to go ahead and send it over to the rest of the body in a circuit called the systemic circuit. All right, some problems with the cardiovascular system, and these are very common here in our region: hypertension and heart disease. Very common because of our diet. Okay, we have a very bad one of the worst diets that you can find out there. Okay, our diet is mostly made up of carbohydrates and fats. All right, so and it's a problem because carbohydrates can actually be stored in the body, right, as glycogen, which wouldn't be as bad as it is, given the fact that excess carbohydrates can actually also be turned into fats. Okay, so if we have an excess, if we ingest an excess of carbohydrates. Now, so that's one problem. Another problem is the direct consumption of fats, right? So these fats are broken down into lipids, which are stored in adipocytes, right? Especially in our abdominal region, right? So over time, if we continue this trend of ingesting fats, then fats can be collected into in the heart tissue and also inside of the coronary arteries, right, of the heart, which can cause obstructions, evidently, and that leads to a high incidence of heart disease here, especially in this region. Okay, so now this is not just a problem that occurs here. We do have a very high incidence of heart disease here in our region, and also hypertension. It's happening nowadays all over the world because of our increases in processed foods, essentially. So what hypertension is high blood pressure. Okay, so high blood pressure occurs because of many reasons. But when dealing with heart disease, right, it occurs because fats are becoming collected inside of our blood vessels, right? They collect and they collect, forming these plaques, right? Plaques are going to go ahead and obstruct the blood flow inside of vessels, which is going to make the heart pump faster, essentially. All right, so now here's the circulation of blood within the heart. Blood that is coming from the body, right, through the inferior vena cava and also the superior vena cava here, makes it into the right atrium, which pumps the blood into the right ventricle through the tricuspid valve. And then from the right ventricle, it's pumped over to the pulmonary trunk, which is going to go ahead and take it over to the lungs using these pulmonary veins right here. All right, so the lungs are going to go ahead and oxygenate that blood, and then they're going to return it over back to the heart via these pulmonary arteries, right, that lead into the left atrium. And then the left atrium is going to go ahead and pump it down to the left ventricle through this bicuspid valve. And then the left ventricle is going to go ahead and pump it over to the aorta, which is going to take it to the rest of the body. All right, so these arteries here lead over to the head and also to the arms. And then following the aorta down, right, if you follow it down, then it's going to go and branch out to the rest of the body. All right, so now the heart has a cycle. It's called the cardiac cycle. Okay, it's essentially an alternation between relaxation and contraction. Okay, so relaxation is known medically as diastole, right? And then contraction is known as systole. So again, we alternate between the two. So contraction or systole goes ahead and pushes blood out of the chambers of the heart, and then relaxation allows for the tissue of those chambers to expand and fill with blood. All right. So during diastole, there's blood filling. During systole, there's blood ejection, essentially, from the chambers of the heart. Heart is also controlled electrically, right? We have these two nodes. We have the sinoatrial node on the right atrium, and then we also have the atrioventricular node, also located underneath the right atrium here. So what those are going to do is they're going to go ahead and set the electrical pace by which cardiac muscle is actually going to go ahead and contract. So it all starts in the central nervous system, okay, in an area called the medulla oblongata of the brainstem of the brain. Okay, so signals from there make it over to the sinoatrial node, which is known as the pacemaker, because it's going to go ahead and determine the actual pace at which your heart is going to pump. Okay, so from the sinoatrial node, those signals jump over to the AV node, which then are transferred over to the heart tissues via these Purkinje fibers right here. Alrighty, so sometimes, obviously, the cardiovascular system goes into a rest. So heart attacks are mostly caused by occlusions, by obstructions in coronary arteries. Okay, so I was talking about fat forming deposits called plaques. So if they form in the arteries of the heart, right, those are called coronary arteries, then blood is going to be is not going to be allowed to flow through the heart tissue, leading to heart attack. So blood contains two major types of cells. One is red blood cells, the other one is white blood cells. Red blood cells they contain hemoglobin, right? Hemoglobin allows for oxygen to bind to it, so that oxygen can be taken over to the cells and utilized in cell respiration. Okay, so if you recall, cell respiration uses oxygen so that we are able to produce a lot of ATP, right? That ATP acts as energy to power every single physiological mechanism that we have in our bodies, right? Last topic is the immune system for this lecture. Alrighty, so the immune system has many aspects, many dimensions to it. Okay, let me start off with platelets. Platelets are useful because in case of an injury, which is very common, right? We need to seal the injury back up, right? So the way in which we do it is by using platelets and also fibrin. Okay, so fibrin is essentially a set of fibers that form a clot, which together with platelets help in sealing those injuries again. All right, so now injuries allow bacteria to get into the blood, right, into the tissues. If that happens, right, the rest of the immune system is going to go in and take over and start fighting off these infections. All right, but first and foremost, we have external barriers like the skin, hair, right, and nails, which prevent bacterial infections. All right, so now we also have the inflammatory response. We also have the lymphatic system, and we have white blood cells in case bacteria get in. Now, external barriers, right, are going to be hairs and cilia, right, in terms of sweeping bacteria out, right, of the respiratory system, for example. We also have mucous membranes, which produce a mucus that essentially an antibacterial type of substance, if you will. Mucus kills bacteria. We have gastric juices in our stomach, which also kill bacteria. And then our skin, right, is a protective physical barrier against bacteria. Okay, so I mentioned the inflammatory response. Why is that important? Well, because the inflammation will allow for several things to take place. Okay, so say you get an injury on your skin, right? The first thing that you're going to notice is redness. Okay, so if the reason why you see redness during injury is because localized blood pressure is increased, right? So that more blood can go ahead and make it over to the injury site. Why do we need more blood in the injury site? Well, because blood has white blood cells that kill bacteria, right? There's also oxygen in blood, right? So these cells need to be repaired, and they're going to need oxygen, evidently, to make ATP. We are also going to need immune system cells. So those are the reasons why we increase localized blood flow here in this region. All right. Second thing you'll notice is an increase in temperature. Right? does temperature increase? Well, the reason for temperature increasing in this region here is that bacteria cannot survive in higher temperatures, right? So that's essentially why we increase temperatures. Also, higher temperatures lead to better blood flow, right? Increased blood flow. So just by increasing localized temperature, you're doing two things. You're killing two birds with one stone, right? You're killing bacteria, and you're also increasing blood flow in the region. All right, so a third characteristic of inflammation, and something else you're going to notice, is that the site of inflammation is going to get a little larger, right? So it's going to get inflamed, if you will, right? So that is due to the fact that these immune system cells, right, they accumulate in the region, right? We bring more water into the region, right? So that's called edema. So these fluids are accumulating in the region, again, bringing and recruiting a lot more phagocytes, for example. Phagocytes are white blood cells that, for the most part, eat bacteria, right? So that's what I mean by engulfing, is eating bacteria and destroying bacteria, right? So again, those are the major signs and symptoms of inflammation. Inflammation is good for the body, right? It's good for the body because it's essentially fighting off infection. Okay, so the lymphatic system is also part of the immune system. The lymphatic system makes sure that B and T cells and also antibodies move around the body, right? The lymphatic system is made up of lymphatic vessels, which we're looking at here in yellow. And it's also made up of lymph nodes. Right? Lymph nodes are important because they mature B cells. All right, so another part of the lymphatic system is the thymus gland, which is located in the chest region. The thymus gland matures T cells. Right, so together B and T cells create the antibodies that we need in order to specifically fight bacteria and viruses for that matter. All right, so that's where the specific immunity comes in, right? Lymphocytes make up specific immunity by being composed of B and T cells. Again, these cells produce antibodies, right, which we're looking at here. Antibodies have antigen binding sites. Antigen refers to those particles that are found on viruses and bacteria, which can cause disease, right? So antigens are the parts of viruses and bacteria that make us sick, essentially. So antibodies have a site to bind to antigens, right? So that binding right there deactivates the antigen of viruses and bacteria, therefore deactivating viruses and bacteria. Right? So that's why B and T cells are important. Now, there's this process called clonal selection, physiological process. Okay, it's called clonal selection. When we are invaded by bacteria and viruses, right? So what happens is that these lymphocytes, B and T cells, are going to go ahead and migrate over, right, to the site of infection to be able to recognize what it is that we're being invaded by. So that recognition right there triggers B and T cells to make many copies of themselves. Okay, so that's called clonal selection right there. Clonal selection is a mass production of B and T cells with the abilities to produce antibodies that are going to go ahead and fight off infection. Okay, so that mass production right there produces memory cells, right? These memory cells, over time, they can do two things. They can be toxic to cells that are infected, and they can also stimulate the release of more antibodies. Okay, so these releasing antibodies again is a direct way to fight off bacteria, because these antibodies, again, bind to viruses and bacteria, and they destroy them. Righty, so again, once you're exposed to a virus or bacteria, then you're gonna go ahead and form these memory cells, and those memory cells can last a lifetime, essentially. You're gonna have them forever. So therefore, when you're older, right, you tend to have more antibodies than when you're younger, and you tend to not become as sick as you did when you were younger. There's obviously there's obviously people, right, that don't fall under that category, because the actual diet that you have, right, and also being active, right, if you follow a sedentary lifestyle, then obviously you're not going to produce as many memory cells as you would if you had a close to normal, if you will, diet, mostly plant-based diet, right? If you ingest their vitamins, your minerals, believe it or not, they are very, very important in modulating immune system genes, right, that allow us to form the antibodies that we require in order to fight off viruses like, for example, SARS-2 virus. Okay, so very important there. There's some disorders also of the immune system. They include allergies, autoimmune diseases, right? Immune deficiency, organ rejection. So these can be special circumstances that render immunity useless at some points and in some parts of the body. Okay. So some disorders of autoimmunity, right, include rheumatoid arthritis, through which people with rheumatoid arthritis they form antibodies, right, that have an action in the joints, right? So between bones, we have joints. Those joints contain fluid, right? So antibodies that are active in the joints, they're gonna go ahead and destroy the tissues, right, within the fluid in the joint that is found between bones. So over time, chronically, right, those tissues are going to become destroyed, essentially deforming, right, body parts of patients. And this takes a long time. This takes decades, essentially, rheumatoid arthritis, right? There's also type 1 diabetes, and there's also multiple sclerosis, again, all being autoimmune diseases. We have talked about immunodeficiency, right? For example, that which occurs in AIDS, right? But there's other immunodeficiency diseases, like, for example, severe combined immunodeficiency, right? SCID. Immunodeficiency diseases like AIDS, as mentioned, right? And these are evidently, this one's caused by HIV, but it's not the only one. There's many more. Now, vaccinations or immunizations are important because you are purposefully, right, exposing, right, the person to some part of the inactive virus, right? So what vaccines are, vaccines contain the antigen, which is not active anymore, of the virus, or bacteria, which can cause disease, right? So if you go ahead and inject or give these vaccinations, right, to people, and vaccines, yes, they can obviously, for the most part, when we think of vaccines, we think of the needle, right? But they come in many forms, right? There's drops, there's pills, there's IV medications, right? So again, reason why they're important is because they contain the inactive antigen of the virus or bacteria that can make us sick, right? So inserting that antigen into our blood is going to go and form the memory cells that we need in order to fight off that infection if we do manage to become infected with the virus or bacteria. Okay, so again, this is the last topic of lecture, the part 1 of the lecture on human body systems. The second part is going to go ahead and be uploaded shortly.